online or in store.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the Van Leer Institute series on ideas. I'm your host, Renee Garfinkel. We're honored to have Eric Cline with us today to talk about his new book, After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. His earlier book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize and sets the background for this latest work, which explores what followed the Late Bronze Age collapse. The new book offers powerful insights that are relevant to us today, insights into resilience, innovation, and transformation in the face of crisis. Dr. Cline is professor of classics and anthropology at George Washington University and the director of the university's Capitol Archaeological Institute. Eric Cline, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
After 1177 BC builds on your earlier work, which explored the collapse of civilizations in the Late Bronze Age. In your new book, you argue that the period following the collapse wasn't a dark age, as is generally assumed, but was rather a time of innovation. Tell us about the evidence that supports this reinterpretation.
Yeah, great question to begin with. It used to be that the period after the Late Bronze Age collapse, which took place about 3,200 years ago, so 1200 BCE, was seen as a dark age, the world's first dark age. But just like the medievalists don't like their period now being called a dark age, and they prefer to call it late antiquity or the early Middle Ages, so too the archaeologists and ancient historians in my period don't want ours to be called a dark age either, and we would rather call it the name that we use, which is the Iron Age, which marks the fact that iron takes over from bronze as the primary metal that people are using for weapons and tools. So this is the period that lasts from about 1200 BCE down to the early 8th century BCE, down to, say, when the first Greek Olympics are held. This is the period after the Trojan War, after the Exodus, if either of those actually did take place, and marks the attempt to crawl back out after their major interconnected network of societies has collapsed. So what we had during the Late Bronze Age for about 500 years in the second millennium BCE was an interconnected society group of about 8. I call them the G8 from that ancient world. And it's people that your audience has heard of: the Mycenaeans in Greece, the Minoans on Crete, the Canaanites, Cypriots, Hittites, Assyrians, Babylonians, and so on. But that interworked network comes to a crashing halt at about 1200 BCE, as I said, and they have to then try to figure out how to survive, how to transform, how to cope, how to adapt, whatever. And it's in that period then that we actually see resilience, we see innovation, we see invention, and they are things that we're still using today. I just mentioned iron. That is one of the main inventions at this time. They had already been using iron a little bit, but not major, and so they turned to that at this point. The other thing that they start doing, though, is that they standardize the alphabet. This is what the Phoenicians do. They're actually the surviving Canaanites in central Canaan. Think the area today of modern Lebanon, and that would be where the Phoenician homeland is. And they standardize the alphabet and then spread it around the Mediterranean, all the way to Greece, where it becomes the Greek alphabet, and to Italy, where it becomes the Latin alphabet, which of course we're still using today to write English and French and German and Spanish and Italian. So those two innovations, if you will, are a hallmark of the period after the collapse. And as some of my colleagues have said, any period that sees such invention, such innovation can't be called a dark age. And so instead, we prefer to call it the archaeological or ancient historical term that we've given it, namely the Iron Age. So that's just some of the thoughts as to why this is not a dark age. It's not to say that everyone came through unscathed. We see a whole range of what happened to the people and how they reacted in the aftermath. And I think that is in part what makes this period so interesting is how did they adapt to it or not? And that's what I think also holds lessons for us today.
Your writing blends archaeology, history, and social theory. How do you approach the challenge of making such complex interdisciplinary connections accessible to the non-expert reader?
Mm. Well, this is indeed a challenge. It can be, in some ways, harder to write for a general audience than for my colleagues, in part because I want to avoid jargon at the same time as trying to explain concepts. So the way that I actually do it, I mean, I am both an archaeologist and an ancient historian. My degrees are in both. So that makes that aspect relatively easy to do because I'm used to doing that. But telling it to a general audience is something that I guess I've developed over the years, in fact, the decades now. But I'll tell you, my secret actually is to write as if my wife's late grandmother was going to be reading it, and I was explaining it to her. So Ethel Honey Schwartz was my biggest fan, and I would send her drafts of my manuscripts and say, is this clear? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? And she would say either yes or no, and I would adapt it from there. She was my ideal general reader, very smart, very sharp lady, went to college at the age of 15, and, a lifelong learner. And so I thought if I can get my ideas across to her, then I can reach the type of audience that I'm trying to do so. But it is a matter of writing, rewriting, and then rewriting again until it's clear.
I love the image of writing for your grandmother-in-law. That's great.
It's true, absolutely. Yep.
So some civilizations disappeared, and others did more than just cope and survive. They flourished. How did the Phoenicians emerge as the dominant maritime power during such a chaotic time?
Yeah, a great question. What they did in a nutshell was take advantage of the situation, and they flourished in what was a period of chaos. Now, this is something that Nassim Nicholas Taleb has talked about. You may be familiar with him. He's the one that popularized the term Black Swan event a couple of years ago. But he has another book called Anti-Fragile. And in it, he defines it as something, some person, some entity that flourishes during an age of chaos, that takes advantage of it. And that's exactly what the Phoenicians do. So, and I should preface it with the fact that they would not have called themselves Phoenicians. That's the later Greek term for them. That's what Herodotus calls them. It's what Thucydides calls them. They would have said, I'm an inhabitant of, and then they would name their city-state. And we're talking about the cities that are still around today because the Phoenicians are based in Beirut, Byblos, Tyre, Arvad, and so on. So we have their records, some of them, not entirely, because there haven't been that many sites excavated up there. But it's quite clear that what they do is step into the vacuum that had been caused by the collapse of the international network that were connecting everyone that I've mentioned before, the other Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, Hittites, Egyptians, Cypriots, Mycenaeans, Minoans. One of the big trading partners that went down is a site called Ugarit, which was located on what is now the coast of northern Syria. And when that site went down, we know it was attacked by humans and destroyed by fire. There's a meter of destruction in the city, and it was abandoned for about 400 to 600 years. When that city was destroyed and others withdrew from the mercantile routes leading across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians stepped in and took over. One of my colleagues has simply said the Mediterranean became a Phoenician lake. Now, what is it that allowed them to do that when others were not is a great question. And I don't have an obvious answer. It's one of the things that I tried to take a look at in the book. But it is possible it's because they were so decentralized. It wasn't a, one king, one kingdom area, like you had the pharaoh in Egypt, for example, or the king in Assyria, or in the Hittite homelands up in Anatolia. Instead, you had a series of these autonomous little city-states, each out for themselves. And that may actually have been what allowed them to survive the collapse and then to take advantage of the chaos. Most of the other big kingdoms and empires either go down totally, like the Hittites, or are impacted quite a bit, like the Egyptians, or even the Assyrians and Babylonians are affected as well. But the Phoenicians managed to make it through. So they are different from the others and they survive better. So one wonders if that is a link between the two.
If a modern equivalent of the Phoenicians exists today, can you guess or what it would be?
Um, no, actually, because I wouldn't have predicted that the Phoenicians would be the ones that came through, and I will not be able to predict which of us makes it through today. History is so variable and everything changes. But the one thing that I do is in the book, towards the end, I break, I think it's called the fourth wall, and I speak directly to the readers and I ask, what's going to happen to us? And by us, I was thinking of the United States in particular. What's going to happen to us if there's a societal collapse today? And how are we going to do in the aftermath? And I actually asked the reader, are we going to be Phoenicians or are we going to be Mycenaeans? How are we going to do? Because the Phoenicians did a heck of a lot better than the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece did. So I'm not sure if I can predict who the modern day Phoenicians will be. I'm sure there will be some, but that's where I'm kind of hoping that futurists will step in and say, okay, you gave us the ancient history. We'll take over from here and start to try and do some predictions like that. But I'm not so optimistic. I see all of the circumstances that led to the late Bronze Age collapse. I see them around today, and I'm basically counting the minutes, days, hours, weeks before we undergo some sort of societal collapse today. I'm not optimistic in the least about us surviving.
Is there an innovation today that corresponds to iron in the Iron Age that
Well,
you think will shape us?
there should be. There absolutely should be. And I think I mentioned this somewhere in the book, but I'm not sure if I did. I've certainly talked about it in interviews since the book came out. Um, it used to be that people said, the equivalent of tin in the late Bronze Age, because you need tin to make copper, to make bronze, tin plus copper, you got 10% tin, 90% copper. And if you don't have tin, then you have trouble. And they said, tin back then was our equivalent of oil today. Well, I think today it's more like rare earths, like lithium that's used in computer chips. And if that supply is cut off for whatever reason, we're going to be in as much trouble as they were during the late Bronze Age when It looks like perhaps the tin was cut off to a certain extent. And so, if we don't have the computer chips, it affects everything from not only computers to cars and everything else. I mean, think back to the supply chain shortages that we had not so long ago, and especially during the pandemic. So I don't think we have an innovation like iron yet, but we sure need to do so. And this is the time to start upping our game, to start being inventive, to start being innovative, to anticipate what might happen. Um, there have been people, talking obviously about resilience these days. Resilience is a real big, big word, but I was introduced to a term the other day. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, presilience, as in to be prepared for resilience, to be prepared ahead of time. And that's what we need to do. So there needs to be some invention, innovation out there to kind of help us get off the present track that we're following.
Well, let's talk about something a little simpler than that, your methodology. In the book, how did you balance archaeological evidence on the one hand with written sources on the other to craft your narrative?
Well, I've always told my students that if we take archaeology, which I really am first and foremost, I love nothing better than to being out in excavating in the dirt. If you take archaeology and you take the written texts from antiquity and you put them together, that's when you get history. That's what we need, is the actual archaeological remains, the material culture remains, plus the text. And that's how we can then try to reconstruct ancient history. So I try to pull them together in both of my book in the books and using both. But in part, I do it because, and I say this towards the beginning of this book, I want to be transparent, not only what we know, but how we know it. So I don't want to just be pontificating from on high, as it were, and telling the reader, this is what we know, and this is what you should believe, and this is what I think. I want to say, look, we know this because in 1848, so and so was excavating at this mound, and he found an inscription. Once it was translated, the inscription says thus and such. Right. So I want the reader to be able to go, oh, okay, so now I know when you're telling me that the Neo-Assyrians did such and such, you're telling me that because you've read about it on this inscription that somebody 150 years ago found. And yes, absolutely, I would say to them, if we were having a conversation. So you know where the information is coming from. I also personally just think it adds much to the story if you can flesh out, as it were, just the bare bones of the narrative with the backstory. It's, I guess, giving it color, one might say. But I also think that the narratives of the early archaeologists absolutely fascinating. I mean, it must have been so interesting to be around at that time, just 100, 150 years ago, knowing that everything that they were finding was changing our view of the ancient world because everything was new at that point to us, basically. And so I do think that I kind of owe it to the readers, but also honestly, it makes it more interesting for me to tell the backstory of these facts. And I found that if it's interesting to me, I can make it interesting to the readers. And that, along with talking to Ethel Honey Schwartz, my late grandmother-in-law, that is my other rule of thumb, that if something is boring to me, it's going to be boring to the readers. So let me change it up. Let me rewrite it so that it becomes interesting to me and therefore hopefully to the readers. And I think that blend of archaeology and ancient history, along with making it relevant to today without pushing it too much, I think that combination makes the story interesting to the readers, or at least hope it does.
Dear old work platform, it's not you, it's us. Actually, it is you. Endless onboarding? Constant IT bottlenecks? We've had enough. We need a platform that just gets us. And to be honest, we've met someone new. They're called Monday.com, and it was love at first onboarding. Their beautiful dashboards, their customizable workflows got us floating on a digital cloud 9. So no hard feelings, but we're moving on. Monday.com, the first work platform you'll love to use.
James, you wear a lot of hats. You're a veteran and household chef, a self-taught barber and dream chaser and student. You're an ander. At National University, we see the whole you. That's why we've created online and hybrid programs that flex to help you balance your full life so you can focus on what's right in front of you. National University, supporting the whole you. Learn more at nu.edu.
And what challenges did you face in reconstructing the histories of societies like the Mycenaeans, where there's hardly any evidence?
Yeah, that is a problem. And this is where archaeology comes in as well, because, we're only finding, who knows, maybe 10% of what was originally there. So we have huge gaps in our findings, huge gaps in our knowledge that we essentially have to sometimes use imagination to try to reconstruct the entire jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes we have a lot more information than others. In fact, sometimes we have almost too much, and you can get way down in the weeds with the details. And other times we have almost nothing, and we have to really read into the archaeological record. So, yeah, something like the Greeks on the Greek mainland after the collapse, when the Mycenaeans and the Mycenaean society have essentially disappeared, and they have to build from the ground up again, essentially from scratch. That's where we're dependent on archaeology in particular, because they're not writing during these centuries, the 10th century, the 9th century. They've kind of forgotten how to write. They're not using Linear B from the late Bronze Age yet, and they haven't yet adopted the Phoenician alphabet, not till probably close to the 8th century BCE. So there we're dependent on what archaeology finds in terms of graves, the remains of houses, material culture, and so on. But on the other hand, if you go elsewhere, like to the Assyrians in ancient Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, they never lost writing. They continue writing the entire time, leaving inscriptions, year after year after year, including annals of what the king did. And there we have almost too much information, though, again, it only tells us about the upper echelons of society. The 1% does not tell us about the average person in the street. So I warned the readers at the beginning of the book that the coverage that I'm going to be following and the details is going to be uneven depending on what society we are looking at. So, but it's the best that I can do. And essentially, the book, just like the original book, the 1177 BC book, is basically a statement of our current status, what we know and what we don't know right now.
The Israelites emerged during this period. How do you think the collapse influenced their development?
Well, this is a great question, and one that is still debated at this time. The coming of the Israelites, exactly, what happened and when. And this is, of course, tied to the question of the Exodus. Did it happen? If so, when and in what manner did it? But cutting to the chase, I will simply say here that in the aftermath of the collapse, when the Egyptians have withdrawn from the area of the southern Levant, from southern Canaan, which they did in about 1140 BCE, give or take, and the collapse of the Canaanite society that had been there at Megiddo and Lachish and Hatzor and Jerusalem during the late Bronze Age, this is where we get the rise of the Israelites. We get other kingdoms as well. Not only are we going to get, the United Kingdom of David and Solomon, and then the divided kingdoms of northern Israel and southern Judah. We also get other small kingdoms like Moab and Edom and Ammon. So it's part of a pattern that we see where the great empires and kingdoms of the late Bronze Age have fallen or withdrawn into themselves. And in the ensuing centuries, we get a series of small city-states, if you will, small kingdoms. So not only the small city-states of the Phoenicians, but also the Israelites. And it is that, I think, that collapse of the globalized network from the late Bronze Age that allows the Israelites to come in, if you will, on the heels of everything and perhaps take advantage of the chaos also at that time. There is the question, as I said, as to when the Israelites come in, or if they had always been there. There are arguments that they had already been up in the hill country. So I was on the fence, shall we say, as to whether they survived, transformed, adapted like the other societies did, or if they came in the aftermath. So for our purposes, let's just say that the aftermath provided the perfect situation for them to be able to flourish and take advantage of the situation.
Eric, you're so deeply immersed in these ancient cultures. Let me ask you a question just for fun. If you could have dinner with one figure from the post-collapse world, an Assyrian king, a Phoenician trader, a Greek chieftain, whom would you choose and why?
That's a great question. And it can only be one person. I can't hold like
Oh,
a Greek
you can have a dinner party. Go ahead.
Okay, that's why I would love that. Have like a Greek symposium with 8 people there, right? A dinner party. Wow. And then somebody from after the collapse. Uh, Boy, okay, one of the Neo-Assyrian kings for sure. I'd love to be able to talk to Shalmaneser III and ask him what really happened at something like the Battle of Karkar. I'd also, wow, I would love to meet Sheshank, who could be the biblical Shishak, and talk to him. Other people. Well, it depends on whether they lived or not. I mean, if Homer is around and actually a real person, would love to talk to him, find out what's going on there. But I would also, I'd almost rather have a dinner party with people from the late Bronze Age. Would love to talk to Akhenaten and find out about his religious revolution and did he really start like a version of monotheism? Love to talk to Shuppiluliuma of the Hittites and ask him if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. So, and Hatshepsut. I mean, there are so many people from the Bronze and the Iron Ages that I would love to live back then and meet them. But if I did get transported back then, I'm sure I wouldn't live much longer than 24 or 36 hours with my eyesight. I would probably have walked off the nearest cliff by accident. But there are so many interesting people, men and women alike, that I would love to have the opportunity to meet. But the best I can do is try to reconstruct their lives through my writing.
And your book makes us curious about them. Finally, Eric, you've written about collapse, about resilience. What historical era are you thinking of exploring next?